The year of the snake has begun, and it is time for our annual tradition of listing the 10 books that I have enjoyed reading the most last year. These are not books that were released in 2024, just ones that I happened to read that year. I will give a short description of each book, and if you find one of them interesting yourself, there's links in the description. So let's get to it. The Fierce and Beautiful World by Andrei Platonov. Platonov is a Russian communist writer who lived through the Russian Revolution and wrote stories set in contemporary times, typically centering around common workers and peasants. What made Platonov unique among Soviet authors was that he was a modernist writer coming from a working-class background, and I became interested in reading his works after hearing about him in a lecture on Marxist aesthetics. In my experience, there's a calm sadness pervading his stories, and yet at the same time an appreciation for the beauty of the mundane, beauty in both nature and machinery. Even stylistically, his writing has a very mundane quality to it, as he wrote the way regular people spoke, sometimes expressing himself in ways that would technically be considered incorrect. His approach placed him at odds with the state-mandated literary standards of socialist realism, and though he was a committed communist, his writings were accused of everything from nihilism to Kulak psychology to Trotsky's deviation. Because of this, it took several decades for many of his works to get published and earn the attention of the reading public. This book is a collection of stories, the longest and in my opinion most memorable of which is called John, or Soul. It centers on a student who finishes his studies in Moscow and is then sent to the tribe in which he was born in Central Asia, appointed by the Communist Party to bring progress and welfare to this tribe, which lives in perpetual deprivation. And above all, the story is a depiction of the struggle for survival. Reading Capital Politically by Henri Cleaver. There are many reading guides to Marxist Capital, and this one is unique in how impatient it is. I wouldn't recommend it if you want a highly detailed and careful analysis of Capital as a work of theory, but I do recommend it if you want a book that introduces Capital by immediately applying it to practice. The book covers only the first 3 chapters of Volume 1 and explains every category in terms of the ways in which it shapes the lives of working-class people and the society in which they live. Henri Cleaver was a student activist in the late 60s, and this book, published in the 70s, does feel to be written in the spirit of the New Left student radicalism of his time, taking up what might generally be described as ultra-left political positions. Cleaver takes a lot of influence from a variety of dissident strands of Marxism, from Marxist humanism to French communization theory and Italian workerism. By utilizing the notion of the social factory, Cleaver's approach shows how the Marxist analysis of capital can be extended beyond the factory and even beyond wage labor, and proposes a very expansive understanding of the working class, looking at the ways in which the unwaged labor of housewives, peasants, and even students can be essential in the continued creation of value and the reproduction of labor power, and therefore also has a role in the class struggle. Because of how concretely it applies the theory, the book is quite clearly dated, and the welfare state capitalism it analyzes and critiques is very different from the neoliberal capitalism we live in today, but I found its insights useful nonetheless. The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. 2024 was the year that I began educating myself more on the topic of Palestine, and this book, written by one of the leading Palestinian scholars alive today, covers the incessant offensive against Palestine in the 100-year period going from 1917 to 2017, emphasizing Israel as an occupying colonial regime, backed up first by British imperialists and then, of course, the American ones. It's a great book for those who seek to become familiar with the region's 20th century history. For some reason, even Joe Biden was seen holding it last year. It's a crucial book in that it covers not only the atrocities carried out against the Palestinians, but also the mistakes that have been made by Palestinian political movements as well, and the cases in which the Palestinian people were failed by their own leadership. It explains how and why Hamas attained the kind of influence it currently has, and provides crucial political lessons for both those within Palestine and those outside it. Men in the Sun and Other Palestinian Stories by Ghassan Kanafani. In addition to learning about Palestine in general, last year I also learned about Ghassan Kanafani, an influential Palestinian Marxist who was the leader of the Marxist organization Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He was killed with a car bomb by the Israeli secret police when he was only 36 years old. And yet he had already become not only Palestine's most influential Marxist, but one of the most influential writers of Arab fiction. And this book is a collection of stories he wrote, headed by his most popular novel, Men in the Sun. Men in the Sun is a work which, rather than focusing on explicitly political events, explores political psychology through the lives of three Palestinians seeking livelihood, and it's quite bleak. It contains no hope and no heroism, but a stark, honest look at the defeatism, despair, and passivity that colonialism often creates. My favorite text in this collection, however, is Letter from Gaza, a heartbreakingly beautiful short story written in the form of a letter about finding meaning in the midst of destruction. The Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 by Karl Marx. While I have, of course, read excerpts of these manuscripts many years ago, it was only last year that I finally read the manuscripts from start to finish, and I find them incredibly interesting. These were manuscripts written by the young Marx when he was only 24 years old, and include general ruminations about the philosophy of life, the beginnings of Marx's materialism and economic studies, and most famously the introduction of his notion of alienation. The manuscripts were not released to the public in Marx's lifetime, being published by the Soviet Union only in the 1930s, and it took a couple of decades for their influence to really take hold. But many Marxist thinkers came to view these works as quite crucial in the ways in which they provide otherwise hidden context to Marx's philosophy and the development of his thought. In particular, these manuscripts became extremely influential in the development of Marxist humanism in the 50s and 60s, which argued that the 1844 manuscripts reveal aspects of Marx's thought that is otherwise neglected by overly economistic readings of Marx. Ways of Seeing by John Berger. Ways of Seeing at this point is a classic of contemporary cultural theory, a highly accessible work which analyzes art and visual culture more generally from a Marxist perspective, drawing a lot in particular from Walter Benjamin's work on mechanical reproduction, which was featured in my top 10 list of 2020. The great thing is, if you don't have the capacity to read books for whatever reason, Ways of Seeing originally came out as a documentary series hosted by John Berger in the 70s, which I recommend everyone to watch. There's no excuse not to. Starting out with a Benjaminian analysis of what happens when technology makes images infinitely reproducible, Berger goes on to discuss the ways in which modern visual culture manifests itself in relation to gender, commodities, and advertising, with each step referring back to examples of modern European painting. The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. Bachelard is a French philosopher who started out in the philosophy of science, but became increasingly interested in phenomenological explorations of poetry and art. Here, he explores art from the perspective of houses and homes, the way that our homes shape our spiritual life and creativity. He speaks of attics, basements, chests, cupboards, and drawers, and by extension the habitats of animals like bird nests and caves, trying to boil down the poetic essence of what the experience of inhabiting a place is like. He writes that, before ever being thrown into the world, as Heidegger says, the human being is first laid in the cradle of the house. The dwelling for him is a fundamental aspect of the phenomenology of human existence. He is inspired a lot by Jung, so he also speaks of houses in terms of archetypical images that appear repeatedly throughout cultures, such as the hut or the castle, which he believes to be deeply embedded in the human psyche, and drawing on Jung sometimes speaks of our psyche itself as being a kind of building. This book is somewhere midway between phenomenology, psychology, and poetry. The book is intended not just to make you think, but to make you daydream, as that is the only way to get to the core of what Bachelard is trying to explore. As an exploration of the poetics of places, I imagine this book could be a great source of inspiration for artists, poets, and writers of fiction, and it doesn't surprise me that it was an influence on the author of The House of Leaves. Personally, reading the book made me think a lot of my grandparents' homes, which have that sense of intimacy that Bachelard is occupied with, something which a lot of newer urban housing seems to lack. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. As you can see, this year I've read more fiction than usual, and this was an American classic that I simply had to read, not only because it's a socialist work about the plight of industrial laborers, but because the main character is Lithuanian, like me. The story is set in Chicago in the early 1900s, where a Lithuanian immigrant becomes employed at a local slaughterhouse. In preparation for writing this book, Sinclair, who otherwise worked as a journalist, actually got a job at one of these Chicago meat plants, so as to experience it firsthand. And he describes in detail just how awful and inhumane the working conditions were at this time, the way the industry would employ workers only to chew them up and spit them out once the working conditions had destroyed their health to the point of being incapable of continuing to work, and the multiple ways they were exploited even outside the workplace. However, when the book reached the public, people appeared to be shocked less by the plight of the working class and more by the disgustingly unsanitary conditions in which America's food products were made. As Sinclair put it, he wanted to reach people's hearts, but instead reached only their stomachs. In fact, it was the commotion caused by this book that led President Theodore Roosevelt to pass new food regulation bills, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. In its formal aspects as a work of fiction, I found the book to be a little lacking. The story structure and the pacing appear somewhat haphazard at times, and in some of the later sections, the book abruptly forgets that it is telling a story so as to focus on the propagation of the author's political views in a way that did not feel natural or organic. Despite that, I still greatly enjoyed the book for its journalistic aspect, for its documentation of the living and working conditions that existed at the time. And I was especially struck by how the book, though realistically describing the existing conditions, at certain points evokes an almost supernaturally overwhelming horror. Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic by Henri Bergson. If you watched my last video, you'll already know about this one, as this is the book my last video focuses on. Though little known today, Henri Bergson was one of the most famous philosophers in the world back when this book was written, and I found this book fascinating because it's very rare to see philosophers discuss laughter and comedy in detail. And in this book, Bergson impressively devises a set of universal principles for what makes things funny, and links them systematically to his larger philosophical views, in a way that is deceptively simple and still applicable to a surprising extent almost 100 years later. Anyway, you should just go watch that video. Schiller as Philosopher by Frederick C. Beiser. In my top 10 list of 2022, I recommended Friedrich Schiller's play The Robbers, but I'm also highly interested in him as a philosopher. Although Schiller's philosophical texts are relatively little read these days, in his time they were actually quite influential, and books like Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man are crucial in the development of German post-Kantian thought. And this book, written by Frederick C. Beiser, one of the greatest living scholars of German philosophy, seeks to give Schiller his due as a philosopher, not just a philosophical poet or an influence on philosophers, but a worthwhile philosopher in his own right. And Beiser does this successfully and highly systematically, going through all of Schiller's philosophical output from his school days to the end of his career. One of Beiser's main targets is the common idea that Schiller, as a romanticist, was an extreme irrationalist who believed morality should be based on vibes, emphasizing that in his moral theory, Schiller was in fact thoroughly Kantian. It's just that he believed the moral perspective does not exhaust what is properly human. I'd also like to give an honorary mention to two texts I enjoyed that aren't really lengthy enough to be called books. The Manifesto of Futurist Music, The Art of Noises by Luigi Russolo, as well as the iconic ancient Greek tragedy, Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus. And for the few of my viewers who speak Lithuanian, I found the book Amerikiečių įspūdžiai Lietuvoje by Šeštokas Margiris very interesting. A sort of traveling memoir in which a Lithuanian living in the US visits Lithuania in the interwar period, and honestly describes the less than perfect conditions he witnessed there, which are of great interest even if he does unfortunately express anti-Semitic and eugenicist views in a couple of parts. As well as Volume 1 of Lietuvos komunistų partijos apibrėža, an official Soviet-Lithuanian history book that covers the history of the Lithuanian communist movement from 1887 to 1920. Obviously, the book has a clear angle, and certain parts should be taken with a grain of salt, but I found it an educational read regardless. Anyway, I really hope you found some of the books on this list interesting, and will read them and enjoy them yourself. Thank you for being one of the relatively small group of people who actually watches these lists, and feel free to recommend the books you've enjoyed this year as well. Now I'd like to thank my patrons, who in large part make it possible for me to read books. 404 Error, Justin Dewitt, Andrei Oliva, Beetle Scratches, Ben E., Blue, Celsius Enjoyer, Circadia, Confirmatio Namai Matthew Dominic, Daniel Swing, Daniel Zotner, Evie Rosk, Eric Owens, Felon Mask. For the first time, I earned above the poverty line and finally got to donate to you. Congratulations. Francois Yue Wu, Harbin Moths, Hong Kong Aesthetics, Ian Fowler, John D. Pagani, Katy Perry is John Benet Ramsey, Kelly Huiskamp, Clement Feis, M. Lim, Marius Labontu, Max Bendick, Max Murphy, Najib Safiaddin, Nathaniel Lark, Nathaniel Owen, Abomunards, Paul Winfer, PDXJ Morris, Polecat, Post Elvis, Procyon, Rachel Ann, Radical Q, Sky, Stax Murner, The Frida Kahlo Enjoyers Club, The Joker from 2016, Tor Larson, Victor Redko, Wentao Suyi, Yesterday's Rice, Yang Huanghua, as well as all of these wonderful patrons. My patrons had early access to this list, and if you support me on Patreon, you'll not only get some exclusive updates, but get to vote in polls which determine the topic of my next video. I don't yet know what my next video will be about, so I'll be putting up a new poll pretty soon. Anyway, I hope that 2025 has been kind to you so far, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you.